On Trial with Josh Lowry.
Hello and welcome to today's episode of On Trial with Josh Lowry, where we put one issue at a time on trial. I told you guys I was probably going to change the name of the podcast. The Josh Lowry podcast was not the most original name for a podcast ever, but when I tried to become a professional wrestler, I also wrestled under my real name because I couldn't think of anything. So coming up with names for things, not my specialty. All right, today, the issue we're going to put on trial, we're going to talk about police violence, specifically use of excessive force. It's very, very topical and timely because right here in Indianapolis, we had an issue that made the rounds, made the news this last week. So here's what happened. There was a guy, a young man, looks like an adult, but I mean, I think he's probably in his 20s. It's a Saturday night, like 3:30. It's downtown area with bars. If you've ever been downtown Indy, you would recognize the area from the video. So apparently right before this, there's some sort of altercation, people yelling at each other, arguments, so on and so forth. Some police came to, assess the situation, I guess you would say. So the video starts, and this guy is standing there with his hand in his pocket. And I don't mean as though he's reaching for something, like he's just standing there with his hand in his pocket. His right hand, his left hand is just out. We'll put the link, by the way, to this video in the notes so you guys can watch it. I'm going to describe it, but you can see it for yourself. You may have already seen it for yourself. It's been all over the news, right? So this guy is standing there. This police officer walks up. This IMPD police officer. Now, it looks like he's got a gun. The police officer. Apparently, this is a high-pressure air launcher, is the way it was described. I guess it kind of shoots like rubber pellets, I think. So he walks up, the police officer walks up to the guy, and the man's first reaction is, he says, "Why are you walking up to me with that?" I mean, the guy's just standing there, right? And the police officer approaches him with that pellet gun out. Well, I'm going to call it a pellet gun, all right, for the purposes of this, just to make it clear. So the man says that. Now the police officer walks like right up to this guy. He then reaches out and kind of pushes him back. Now let's be like, you'll see the video. It's not a violent shove. It looks like he's trying to create space. However, the police officer was the one that got right up to him, needing to create the space. At which point, the man kind of swats away at his hand. And he says, "Why are you fucking touching me?" Yes, the man did make contact with the police officer's hand when the police officer pushed him back. I think swat is the correct term. Like, you're swatting away someone's hand. I would not call it overly violent, but I do understand that there was still contact made there. So at that point, the police officer, without saying anything else, now granted, after this guy swatted his hand away, the guy's still standing there. All right, he's still just standing there. There's no aggressive movement made whatsoever. The police officer raises the pellet gun and shoots this guy in the chest. Now those, whatever they are, the rubber bullets, the rubber pellets, we've since seen photos, they left welts. But at the time, the guy doesn't physically react. Now, whether or not that is holding in because of the situation or just didn't hurt, I don't know. But at that point, the man just looks at the officer and just says, "Are you serious?" The officer then takes this guy to the ground. There's, I guess, a struggle on the ground. It's kind of hard to see from the camera view, and you end up seeing some officer punching the guy. So this made the news, obviously made the rounds. And the issue that we're going to talk about today is that use of force. And that's the issue we're going to put on trial. So here's the opening statement of the trial today. What you're going to see today, we're going to dig into the issue, not just of force in police use, but why, right? And today my guest is going to be Anuar Velazquez. He's a really cool guy. You guys are really going to enjoy the interview. He spent over 10 years as a police officer himself, and now he's doing a lot of work to help combat culture of use of force or toxic culture, however you want to word that, within the police force. And what we're going to dig into is kind of what's going on, because here's the thing. I think some of these issues, it's black and white, it's obvious, right? Like, George Floyd was murdered, and the cop that murdered him is a bad person, right? There's not a whole lot to dispute there. There's not a whole lot to discuss. But there are a lot more situations that are not as egregious, but there's still something going on that leads the police officer to feel like that use of force is necessary, when to us it may not appear that way. And the thing that I want to dig into is something you're going to hear a lot on this podcast, because it's something that's very true about American culture in general. We deal with symptoms, not causes. Because each time there is a case, and my God, how many have there been over the years of, an unarmed black man getting shot, of, an unarmed woman getting shot, of just any, what I mean? Like, I don't need to singularize it. I'm making up words now. My point is this, is we've all seen it, right? There have been cases, and immediately if it makes it to the news, it becomes a political thing, right? Republicans say, oh, we're pro-cop. Everybody deserves to get shot, basically. And then the Democrats get pushed back on their feet almost, and they feel like they can't discuss what is happening, because they're afraid that they're going to come off as though they're anti-police officer, anti-security, anti-law enforcement. And so we're not getting anywhere, because we're not actually having a discussion about making anything better. So my framing for this conversation is, when I used to be at the Attorney General's office, I did a lot of work with the Indiana State Police. And I found there's all kinds of police officers, right? You have some people, they were in the military, and law enforcement just seemed like the next logical step for their career. You have some people that there seemed to be a desire to have authority over others. But you also have a lot of people that that's all they ever wanted to do, was be a police officer. Their dad was a police officer, their grandfather was a police officer, their mom worked in law enforcement, whatever, right? And so it's hard to generalize that there's necessarily a person or a type that's leading to the situation. So something's happening. But if we just, every time that there is a use of excessive force, we just go, he's bad, fire him. We're not getting anywhere, because we're not treating the underlying cause that's leading to those uses of excessive force. Now, here's the thing. I do feel comfortable in saying this, although I'm not in law enforcement myself, obviously. I talk to a lot of police officers that they really do care, right? They do want to protect the public, and they know that these bad apples are bad apples. But there's still something in the culture that's preventing those bad apples from getting taken care of. I don't know if take care of, what you know what I mean, the training, whatever they need to correct that behavior. One of the most interesting things I ever heard about this, Ani Coleman, For those of you that don't know, Ronnie Coleman is the greatest bodybuilder of all time. He won 8 Mr. Olympias. And he was a police officer before his career really took off in bodybuilding. Actually, he won his first Olympia while still being a police officer. It's in the DVD about his first Mr. Olympia title. It's an amazing watch. That's where if you ever hear anybody yell lightweight or yeah buddy, that's coming from Ronnie Coleman. That's not the point. Here's the point. So there was an interview, I think it was right after the George Floyd murder, and Ronnie was asked about, as a police officer, did he see that kind of stuff? And he said something along the lines of, when that stuff happens, when there's, this excessive force, something horrible, a lot of the police officers are like, yeah, we saw that coming. Like, he pointed out that the officer that killed George Floyd had tons of complaints filed against him. And according to Ronnie, it was more of like and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but what I interpreted from what he was saying was there was a system that allowed that to happen, basically. And if there's this thing where whenever there's this excessive force used that was unnecessary, people are looking at it and going, other officers, are looking at it going, yeah, that we figured to be that guy. If it's that obvious, why is it not getting stopped beforehand? So that is what we're really going to dig into today. Me and Anwar are going to talk about culture. These uses of excessive force and what we saw in Indianapolis last weekend, where this guy's just seemingly standing there and he ends up getting shot with this pellet gun, and he literally seems confused as to why that happened. That didn't just happen out of nowhere. There's an entire culture. That event is a symptom, not a problem. We need to figure out what is that underlying culture that's leading to that. So that's what we're going to dig into with Anwar. This is going to be a very, very enlightening and intriguing episode, because I think this is a topic where immediately a lot of people retreat into their corner and they say you're either pro police officer or you're pro criminal. And look, guys, that's not the way world works, right? Very rarely is everything in plain black and white. There's grays, there's middle grounds, and we're just talking past each other, and we're not actually working on the underlying issue and getting anywhere. So coming up is my conversation with Anwar. Stick around, and then afterwards I'll be back to give my closing argument. All right, we are here with our guest, Anuar Velazquez. He, well, you know what? Why would I try to tell you about him more than he could? So, Anuar, if you could, please just tell the people a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I appreciate the consideration. I'm looking forward to how this conversation unfolds. Thank you for opening the time and the invitation for me to be here with you today, just to evolve in this conversation. But yeah, so Anuar Velazquez, I live in the Hamilton County area. Originally I'm a first generation immigrant. I grew up in Mexico up until the age of 13. And then my nuclear family decided to uproot ourselves and move to South Bend, Indiana, right around 2003. I lived in South Bend majority of my life. Decided to go to college in Bloomington, where I studied criminal justice to become a police officer. I felt that I always had a passion for policing, especially what I was seeing in the community, how I interacted with police officers in the past. That drew me to want to continue to bridge the gap between communities of color and police officers. So I decided to go back to South Bend after I became a police officer for the state of Indiana, where I worked for the South Bend Police Department. About 2 to 3 years after that, I decided to transfer to another police department here in the Hamilton County area. So overall, I have 10 years of experience in policing, and my career ended right around 2020 when I decided to transition more to the education field. So I went back, got my master's in education with the school counseling focus, and became a school counselor here in the Indiana area. I'm furthering my education by pursuing a PhD in urban education with a minor in school counseling. So aside from that professional aspect, I think a little bit about me as a person. I'm a father of a beautiful biracial little girl. She's about to be 7 years old here in September. I'm also I'm a big follower of classic cars. I like to work on classic vehicles. I myself have a 1990 Bronco and a 76 Datsun 280Z that is getting painted as we speak. So, so yeah, I like to do a lot. I like to be involved in a lot. I'm a big believer in social justice. I've always have. I'm a community organizer. And then I also work for an organization called the Human Solidarity Project, where we travel throughout the United States to work with any organization that is wanting to hire us to work on what we call just human solidarity work. So how to create better relationships not only within yourself but also with those that you work with and those that you work for. So yeah, in short, that's a little bit of me.
I want to actually, before we get to the topic, I guess, of everything, but like, I want to dig in on one thing. You mentioned that growing up in South Bend, what really interested you about the police was the interaction between the police and, people of color.
Mm-hmm.
What specifically, I mean, was there a specific event? Was it your lived experiences? I mean, do you know exactly what it was about that drew you to it?
Yeah, no, for sure. So all the schools that I went to, whether it was middle school or high school in South Bend, there was a lot of heavy police presence. But the police presence that I experienced was more out of controlling behaviors and wanting well, yes, of course, to create a safe environment, but it felt very monitoring, if you hear what I'm saying. So it just felt just very, I don't know, enforcing. It was as if there was a level of intimidation rather than connection. So I recall, like in high school, during our lunch time, in comparison to the high school here in Westfield, during our lunch periods, there would be about 6 to 7 officers in the cafeteria. And we had issues. I mean, it was not your issues of extreme violence, but there were issues in the high school. But I didn't think for me it warranted that level of security presence. But the presence again felt more out of intimidation rather than, hey, let me connect with you. Let's touch base with the students. It was more from like each officer was in charge of guarding a certain area, and they stayed there. They remained there. So I remember going through school resource officer school. It's you have to go through a national recognized like training for about a week to become a school resource officer here in the state of Indiana. And I remember going through that, and one of the school resource officers that was presenting, that was leading the topics in the presentations, I vividly remember him saying, do you want to become the $13 an hour security guard, or do you want to become the officer that those students really look up to and you mentor students? And for me, when I became a school resource officer, that was my lens. I didn't want to just stand around. I didn't want to just guard a wall and have my arms crossed. I mean, it already is pretty intimidating to have an officer in your school with a full uniform. So I wanted to break that down and create more of a welcoming presence, a presence of safety, rather than intimidation again. And for me, it seemed like that was my experience with police officers. Even if I go back to police officers in Mexico, I mean, it was horrible. It was highly corrupt. It was more out of threatening the community, abusing their power. I experienced a little bit of that as well in South Bend. So for me, very early on, I started to see that there was a disconnect, right? A disconnect of policing, what I consider policing, more from the community lens to more of a punishing way. Matter of fact, when I was an officer, there was a lot of officers that I worked with on their laptop, on their school, or not a school laptop, on their work laptop or on their vehicles. They would put the sticker of the Punisher, like the Marvel character. I think it's Marvel. The
Yeah.
Punisher. And it never, it really never made any sense to me because I was like, who are we? Who am I to punish you? Right? When we think of the legal system, the courts are the ones that deliver the quote unquote punishment. But why am I taking that persona? And that should tell us a lot, right? When we take on that persona of the punisher, someone that is here to deliver something when you're committing a crime, it takes it to a level more of, again, an enforcer rather than someone that is there to connect with you.
There's so much irony in that too, because I'm a big comic book fan, and the whole point of the Punisher is he exists outside the legal and outside the law, right? He's literally taken justice into his own hands, and he's not afraid to kill. So I really feel like that sends the wrong fucking message, like from the start when they have that.
And here's the thing,
Yeah,
there was more that type of message, that type of justice on our own hands is really, I really saw it very embedded in the cultural inner workings of police departments. I recall a sergeant from one of the departments that I worked for that would brag about these shirts that they would make that they would wear underneath their uniform. And like some of the messages from the shirts were if you run you bleed, like that type of stuffs, right? And and what I started to take in as I started to look at and observe the system was that younger officers idolize that stuff, right?
right.
You begin to create this heroic notion around that. So then when you have it in your subconscious mind, it will come to the conscious choice at some point in your life, right? Um, so yeah, there was a lot of that, and I agree with you. The irony in that is glaring, but at the same time is disguised in many ways.
So I'm actually going to jump ahead in my questions because you hit on something I wanted to ask you about right there was the culture versus how these people are when they're coming in, right? So when I was at the Attorney General's office, I had some cases where I worked pretty closely with the state police. And I found that there was, a wide array of people. Some people that you would, be proud to serve with, and some that you probably thought were going to cause trouble, right? And what I found, it seemed like there was a lot of it was the way that they felt about policing coming in, right? Because I saw some guys and talked to some where it was the authority that drew them to it. But I saw other guys that that's what their dad had done, and that's what their grandfather had done. And like that is the only thing they thought about growing up. How much of like that mentality that you were just talking about, the younger guys worshiping the being prone, I guess, to worshiping that like violent tendency, is that what you felt like was created by the culture, or were there certain people that were coming in and that's what they're already looking for?
I would say it's a little bit of both. I would almost dare to say, without doing like a research right on this stuff, but I would almost say that there were more officers that changed their mindset by virtue of being deep in that culture, of more of community policing toward what we see today, sometimes with videos that come out and things like that, rather than a larger amount of officers coming in with such a, like what we would call your power hungry, right? I think more officers come in with those good intentions, but then without doing much thinking or without doing much examination of themselves, you're socialized pretty quick, like pretty quick to start to shift the way that you see the work and the way that you see the community. See, there's a good, really good book called Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement. And I was just with the Human Solidarity Project, we were just out in Seattle talking with officers about this stuff. And I had a total of 4 sessions. And in those 4 sessions, by the fourth session, for some reason, I have the book. I've had the book for a long time. And I was like, let me pick this book back up. And I started to go through it again. And I was like, holy smokes. I wonder what this book would have done for me if I would have read it as soon as I would have left the academy. That book is given to almost every officer when you finish the academy. But I would be, I bet you that a lot of officers just put that book away and completely forget about it. See, that book talks about the implications of socialization within the police department, the cultural piece, right? When I was an officer in South Bend, within the first week of me being in training, I was discouraged to think about community policing. I remember being introduced to the detectives in the detective bureau, and they do the typical, "Oh, you're a rookie," like they almost put you through like this hazing process of like intimidate you or like put you on the spot and things like that. So the detectives brought us to the front, the rookies, and they wanted us to introduce ourselves and to tell them why we wanted to become police officers. It was my turn. Before I could say anything, an older detective says, "Before you answer, don't give me the bullshit excuse or the bullshit answer that you wanted to become a police officer to help the community." So then I'm like, well, I was just about to give you that answer, but I guess I did not give you that answer, right? It became pretty clear that obviously it's not going to work out. It truly is not going to work out when that is the fabric of the system. That book actually talks about that mindset shifting within 6 months of you becoming a police officer,
Hmm.
right? And here's the thing. There's a lot of dynamics that are happening here that I think also the community tend to forget. These officers, even though they sign up for the job, we see a lot of stuff that not your typical average person is going to see on a day to day.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like within the time frame that I was a police officer, within the first 3 years, I had already experienced and witnessed at least a number of 30 to 40 deaths. Some of them being homicides, stabbings,
Hmm.
decapitations, right? And I am 21-year old. I'm a 21-year-old kid trying to figure out how this functions. So what I didn't realize was that type of environment and the dysfunctionality that occurs within the department regarding mental health or regarding taking care of that emotional piece is non-existent. So you go home and who do you really metabolize this with? Because we don't want to talk to our parents, we don't want to talk to our spouses. We end up just talking about it with each other. And if anything, we make fun of the incident or the experience rather than actually healing through the experience. So to me, it's no surprise that the suicide rate it's really high with police officers, that the addiction rate is really extremely high with policing, that the divorce rate is extremely high. It overall has become a very dysfunctional type of workplace that is being taken for granted. But again, you go back to it's the cultural piece, right?
Do you think that I felt like the policing in general has become something that's so politicized, right?
Absolutely.
By people that are wanting to prove their point or earn votes, that sometimes there's not actually the desire from politicians and the mayors and the people that are a lot of times leading, at least financially, the police force. They're not actually concerned about the individual police officers. They're concerned about the look, the shield, the idea that I back the blue, I keep the street safe, but really they don't care about that individual officer.
I cannot disagree with more. I cannot disagree at all with that. Because what we're finding when we travel throughout different states and when we work with police officers is there's such a frustration from police officers regarding decisions that are made. There are decisions that are made at the state level or through politics that ends up impacting that officer, right? So, for example, the way that we deal with juveniles, police officers are almost caught in the middle of it. They still have to do their job, but then whatever decision they have to make, it is not backed up by the judicial system or by the government or by the state. So then that child that is in need of major resources is right back on the streets having the same interaction or maybe even worse, a more violent interaction with that police officer. So then those officers are like, well, what do I do? You know what I mean? It's pretty common for police officers to develop the following emotional responses, right? You become jaded, You become extremely, extremely fearful of the environment that you work in. You become like almost neglectful. You almost create this numbing experience and you detach yourself from your humanity to be able to go to work. And these are officers that, again, they signed up to do the job because they wanted safety in their community. I'm telling you, I would say by and large, majority of police officers sign up to do what we would love them to see do, right? But we don't consider what happens in that time that then develops this almost like chess game where we move you, we manipulate you however we want to manipulate you, and then you end up in a position where you're like you're almost having like an out of body experience. And that's also accountability for police officers to recognize this stuff, right? That because that book talks about it too. That book talks about how, as police officers, we are trained to physically protect ourselves, right? I mean, we go through defense tactics classes, learning how to drive the vehicle at high rates of speed in a defensive manner, how to shoot a gun. But the last thing we're taught to do is how to take care of this, right? Matter of fact, in LA County recently, within the past month, they've had 14 or 13 officers commit suicide.
Mm.
That should be concerning. About 6 months ago in Texas, they had a county in Texas, 5 officers from that county, retired officers, committed suicide.
Mm.
So that's telling us something, but we don't want to listen, right? Instead, we want to continue to politicize the issue, right? And we polarize it that you're either here or you're either here. No, at the end of the day, those officers are being stretched to the max, that then lead to outcomes that we end up seeing on the news. And again, I say that very carefully because there's a little bit of accountability on myself as a police officer, that if I'm not seeing that the police department wants to offer me these resources or the opportunities for me to take care of my mental health, I should also take that upon myself. But even then, it is within that cultural realm that we talked about, because it is still a highly stigmatized issue within police departments. The whole, notion of mental health. Are you really okay? Are you not okay? You know what I mean? Like it's still an issue that a lot of police departments are having to deal with. But I'm telling you, a lot of officers, they feel a lot of frustration, but they don't realize how those frustrations and how that numbing experience then turns almost like in an outward response to the community, where it's like, F you. You know what I mean? Like, the state is not taking care of me. My city's not wanting to take care of me. So you know what? I'm just gonna respond to calls like I don't really care. It becomes so natural to take on that response, and you don't realize what you're doing to that community. I remember moving from South Bend to here. I struggled. I struggled a lot. I mean, I worked homicides over there. I worked shootings, stabbings, domestic violence. I was going from call to call to call. Then I come here, and it's like I was going to these calls, and I'm like, why the hell are you calling the police for this? Like, why are you calling me for this? I had a lady crash at an intersection, and she hands me the insurance card, and she's like, here, you call my insurance. And I was like, no, that's not what I just take your policy number and put it on the report. So then her response was like, why do I pay you for? What do I pay you for? Then I was like, hold on, like, you know what I mean? So that's what I'm saying is, in either side of the spectrum, you're still viewed as a tool rather than as a person that can actually be there to provide the best service possible through human connection, right? But right now, there's such a disconnect in politics, in communities, with what's going on with police officers, and there's a high lack of understanding on both sides of how this issue is playing out.
So I think what I'm hearing, and maybe, so I'll just correct me if I'm wrong, right? I think from the outside, obviously I've never been a police officer, right? I worked with some as an attorney, and from the outside, when you see something like the George Floyd, right, the killing by that officer, Derek Chauvin, it's just like immediate. You're like, okay, it's just a bad guy, right? But when this adds up and you see different situations on the news, it just becomes difficult to think there's that many people out there that are going out and intentionally trying to cause this harm. But what it sounds like to me, what you're saying is a lot of it isn't that this is the way the people came in set on this. It's more the way that the cultural, the dealing with the trauma, not dealing with the mental health, and the way they learn to deal with the environment is creating some of these outcomes, not just who that person is as an individual.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think the Rodney King, those examples are more far few in between in comparison to the ones that we're seeing most often in media. I would say those are more out of response from this mindset or this emotional toll that has taken in your career. Again, like some of the stuff that I responded to, I really wonder, like, how would the civilian would have responded to that? You know, my night terrors, those bad dreams that I would have often, they didn't stop up until like I stopped being a police officer. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, they were present all throughout. So think about the psychological effect. I mean, post-traumatic stress has an impact, right? I would really wonder what would be the level or the number of police officers that would be diagnosed with that if we were to do a deep analysis of it. I would say I have it probably undiagnosed. And then also think about this. I didn't come to policing free of any trauma. I came to the job with trauma myself. So it was trauma upon trauma upon trauma. And I was wanting to come in with the best intentions. I myself recall a couple of times where I probably used a little bit more force than necessary. And I can tell you that the last thing I wanted to do when I did my interview, when I would talk to people, when I would connect with the community, it was I never became a police officer to apply that extra force. Mm. But in that moment, there's a triggering effect that occurs based on what I've seen, based on the experiences that I had, the calls that I went on. It almost triggered it, and it was like, again, it was an out of body response. But yeah, there's those bad apples, but those bad apples, I would say that they're less likely to be found in comparison to those officers that are truly. There's more officers that are hurting without realizing they're hurting, and you know the beautiful saying, hurt people unintentionally.
And I think sometimes the reason that we as a society like to make things so black and white is to make it easier on ourselves, right? So when you have those bad apples where it's not really even questionable, what happened is wrong, it can make us feel really good to go, that guy is a bad guy and he should be punished. Mm-hmm. But that's not how life usually is. Usually there's a lot more grays. And when we're dealing with the grays, that reflects more as a society about how the people that are involved are being treated and how they're having to deal with all this, whether it's the police or the people that are dealing with the police. And I think that's harder to grasp. So in our society, we tend to just push that aside and say, let's focus on the really good police officers and the really bad ones. And then we don't have to deal with what we're actually doing as a society.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know that the disconnect and separation is truly the ego solution, right? And that's what we do with policing. We wanna disconnect ourselves from the community. We want to disconnect. Even in politics, we want to separate almost, rather than finding ways. How can we go back and create unity? Because through that unity is what leads to the truth, what we're trying to unfold here. And in my opinion, regardless of what policies we come up with, regardless of what laws we want to pass, until we truly start to take care of the culture, this is not going to change.
Right.
We can come up with policies that are going to be more in favor of policing. The culture is going to be the same. We can come up with policies that take more powers away from the police, the culture of resentment is still going to be there. So there will still be opportunities for that toxic culture to come into the community. But it works both ways, right? It also works on the way of how is the community supporting policing as well. Not supporting in the level of like, I'm for the police or I'm against the police, but supporting in the level of like trying to understand and trying to find ways to create more of a like a harmonious relationship between the two, uh, to be able to establish something healthy. Because I can tell you, and I often hear officers say, and I actually challenge officers as well on this, but I will often hear officers say, I want to be seen as a human being. And my challenge, and I hear them, I agree with them. We all want to be seen as human beings. But what we forget often is when we put on that uniform, our humanity goes out the window. I'm showing up as RoboCop, so you're gonna remember you as Josh. You're gonna remember me as RoboCop. You're not gonna remember me as Anuar or Officer Velazquez. But that also happens out of a process of wanting to protect myself. That if I show up vulnerable in front of you, I'm gonna take that as a you. I might take that as you're gonna see me as weak, and I can't show you that. Matter of fact, pay attention to how officers stand at police calls. We stand like this, holding our vest. We're already guarded, and we're taught to stand like this because my hands are up now. If you try to punch me, now I'm here to protect myself. But again, I'm already showing up protected. So how does this leave any room for a connection to be made? If anything, you may wonder, you may be like, why are you guarding yourself? Hold on. Am I threatening you? Right? I can show up and still be safe in a scene without having my hands up here. I can maybe create a little bit of separation, physical separation without touching you. That's on me. But again, it takes a lot of examination for police officers to go through that process of socialization to be able to see, shit, I've slowly been turning into this. And it has been because of the environment that I work in, the culture of the department that I work for. Um, I didn't realize that I did not only put to the side some of my own personal beliefs and values as a police officer to be a part of the brotherhood, but I also put to the side my identity. So think about just even then the psychological effect that does. I mean, I showed up just as all you're gonna know me, even with coworkers, is just me in a uniform. So even the relationships, the inner workings and the inner relationships with police officers, they're pretty disconnected as it is. So if
Right.
you have disconnect within your organization, what makes you think you're not going to have disconnect within the community?
So one of the things that you said to me earlier that got to be honest, I guess I just didn't expect that was when you talked about the mental health part for the officers, because there's been a lot made, and rightfully so, over the last several years about the mental health of the people to which the police are responding. But for the officers, there's really nothing done for their mental health, or I guess nothing required.
And even when you make it required, again, you have to analyze the culture of the department. Because if your culture is based on the stigma of mental health, you as an officer, as much as you may want to believe in it, you might end up buying into the stigma as well because you're being pulled by the masses.
Mm.
We know that about society. So there has to be a big shift. There has to be you almost have to go through a detox process of this toxic mindset that police departments function within, to move away from mental health is an issue. Mental health is something that is it's a weakness to police officers. Um, you know, it was pretty interesting in 2019. Again, police officers are taught, they're instructed how to protect yourself from danger, right? and how to protect your life. There was a statistical data point in 2019. Roughly 100, less than 150 officers died in the line of duty, not just by being shot, but maybe in an accident, just in different ways in the line of duty they died. That same year, 220 some officers died by suicide. What does that tell you, right? You are more likely to die by your own gun or by your own accord or by the choice based on what you may be struggling with rather than from the community. But when you hear police officers typically will argue, I was protecting myself. I felt unsafe. But you're probably feeling unsafe every day without realizing it. Are you really, my question is, are you really surviving as it is?
Hmm.
Because to me, that data point, it should be a little concerning that we're teaching officers how to protect themselves and less of them are dying by what they're mostly practicing on rather than the thing that they're not getting. They're not getting those mental health resources. And like I said, even when they are, what is that culture in your police department? What does that look like? Is it truly welcoming toward mental health? You know, when a large number of police officers respond to something highly violent or highly traumatic, what does that debriefing process look like afterward? How does that group come back together and metabolize what we just observed? When I went to a scene where a train conductor called thinking that they had hit somebody, well, they didn't realize it was a homeless person that laid on the track and decapitated. I mean, right? We all showed up, and again, I'm 22 at the time. Our debriefing process was getting coffee at 7-Eleven at 3 in the morning, joking about it. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think that stuff sticks with me.
That's so. What's wild to me about this is, so my wife and I are foster parents, right? And before we even start fostering our first child, you have to go through a ton of training, and a lot of the training is on how to help children that have been through trauma deal with the trauma, because the children that don't deal with the trauma grow up and inflict trauma on others, right? There's some absurd statistic about more than half of the people in prison had been through trauma and then put into the foster system at some point in their life. And our entire model and our existence and like the way we judge ourselves as parents is helping those kids work through that trauma. And one of the things that we're very open about with them, because like a kid doesn't want to go to therapy. So I'm very open about the fact that I go to therapy. And I think it helps create a culture around them that, oh, therapy is something that anybody could go to.
Mm-hmm.
Along those same lines, what is it that you think needs to be done to create that culture to where police officers are not just able to seek help about their trauma, but actually encouraged to?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's where I think it would be phenomenal for more officers. You know, I talked to Josh Andrews about this, that you're required as a barber, you're required to do more hours to become a licensed barber than a police officer. To me, that is outrageous. And I'm not talking about like 20, 30 more hours. No, I'm talking about like at least 1,000 more hours to get your licensed barber or your license for a barber, rather than actually receiving a certification that puts a gun in my hip and a badge that can take your liberty or your life away. But in the time that I was a police officer, maybe in the thousands of hours that I received in training throughout that time, maybe less than 10 were trauma informed. Not just trauma informed for the people in the public, in the community, but also trauma informed for myself. So what does that tell us? That we're not prepared for this stuff. So you talk about police officers being, utilized or used in the political ways, in the political swing here. We should be looking at that. Why are we not putting more of an emphasis in those types of trainings. I see it in education myself. You know, educators learn briefly about the Adverse Childhood Experiences test, the assessment on ACEs. It's a trauma test and all that. Well, that test will tell you through research that it can literally change your DNA, your genetic makeup, the more trauma that you experience. So you don't think that's going to have an impact in your learning? You don't think that's going to have an impact in your decision making and the choices, the behaviors that you enter? So then, if I was an educator, I would want to know that. So then when I work with you as a student, how do I work with you in a way that is healing rather than in a way that is re-triggering those traumas? The same thing with policing. You know what I mean? Like, one of the things that we know about trauma, it goes back up to, I think it was like 6 or 7 generations before you. So then you talk about families or grandparents that dealt with violent police officers. You don't think I might be aware of that? So then when you and I encounter each other, you're the police officer, I'm the person in the community. You don't think there's going to be a little bit of a disconnect there, even though that wasn't you that committed that violence, but the badge itself? So that's where I also challenge police officers, because often, like, police officers will say, "Oh, I'm just tired of being called a racist." My challenge to that is they're not calling you a racist. You have to be able to remove yourself from that picture to be able to realize that there's more to that statement than just you. Because if
Right.
they saw you, that person that just called you a racist, if they saw you at the gas station without the uniform, what would be the likelihood that they would come up to you and say, "Hey, you're a racist"?
Right.
Zero, like, it would be none. The likelihood would be zero that they would come up to you and say that. But they are seeing the system, they are seeing the badge through past experiences or maybe what social media portrays. Therefore, that statement is released. Um, but yeah, I mean, I believe that for police officers to start to create a shift here, or for police departments, is one, you have to work on your inner culture, right? And there should also be a level of collective community effort to collaborate with the police department on how to establish those healthier relationships. You know, both sides want to hear from each other, but they're not. Again, they're separated. That is the ego solution, to keep each other separated. Therefore, the truth is never told. But if there was more of a connection between the community and police officers to say, "Hey, this is what we're dealing with. Last night we responded to this many calls regarding these types of crimes that were extremely violent." So then maybe community, maybe pastors, maybe chaplains, maybe community leaders that drive mental health could go to those police departments and offer the services and say, "Hey, how can we come back together? What do you need as well?" Otherwise, what we're doing is we're throwing policing back and forth like a football, and just utilizing the people that are really, again, you look at Seattle, you look at Philly, like, there are areas in Philly right now where there's 1 to 2 officers per, like, 20, 30,000 residents. How do you take care of that? Right? And then go home and feel good about your job, feel good about what you did. So it's only a matter of time that that ticking bomb is gonna explode. But there should also be, and I say this, there can be two things happening that are true. That officer needs help, and that officer should also take accountability for their own healing, for their own process of becoming whole within themselves. So then that ticking bomb doesn't go off.
Have you seen, examples of success, like places where this is being addressed and it is getting into the culture?
There is some success with departments that are actually that are putting an emphasis on community policing, that are actually willing to. And when I say community policing, what I mean is a part of that old school, like, you walk the beat type of police officer, that the community knows you by name. Here in Westfield, I really like, even though it was used somewhat like a quota per se. I really liked that our supervisors had a number of, like, foot patrols that we needed to hit a day, right? Is just getting out of the car really created that type of relationship, right? Now, that can be a little bit more difficult when you have police departments that are much larger that are going from call to call to call to call. Uh, but this is what I'm going to say. Interestingly enough, I think a lot of this could be taken care of by education, by us also working to solve our education issues. You know what I mean? Like actually working on increasing the opportunities in education for our children. Because what we know is that poverty or lack of education is what drives crime. So at some point there has to be a conversation, and I think that's where policing can also be a part of that solution. When I was a school resource officer here, I remember starting a program where I would take, along with with two school counselors here, we would take a group of students, historically marginalized students, first generation students, on college trips. I'm a police officer, right? But you got to think outside of the box to be able to really connect with students in a different way. But when I was working here, I'm like, what else can I do that's beyond the scope of work that I do, beyond the safety piece, to impact students in a different way? And that's when I was like, oh, what if I never, when I was in high school, I didn't go to a college field trip. So I think that would be beneficial for some students that have never, whose parents have never gone to college, to look at a college. And they're seeing me outside of the uniform. They're seeing me outside of that, that the very guarded uniform, clothing, and they're able to relate to me in a different way. So how can officers also use their lived experiences to relate to the community in ways that it creates a level of connection? Um, I think what I love, one of the programs that I love most about policing is the Police Athletic League. I don't know if you ever heard of it. We ran it in South Bend often. I can't remember exactly what police department originated or created it, but then it became a federal program. And during the summers, we taught kids how to play tennis. Not that I knew how to play tennis, I was learning alongside the kids. But we had kids from like ages of 4 all the way to like 17, and we were playing tennis, right? Programs like that show a lot of benefit. They show a lot of connection to the community. It shows those kids that maybe they might have seen a parent get arrested. It gives them an opportunity for a police officer to be seen in a different light. So as many opportunities as we can create to show the opposite of what we may see on social media often, it can provide an opportunity for that relationship to be restored. There's a lot. There's a lot that police officers are doing that is great, but we also don't talk about those things,
Right.
right? And I think it's also an unfortunate, and that's where we go to the back and forth or being politicized. I mean, how often do you see the news showing that stuff as well?
Right. You mentioned education and poverty
Hmm.
being linked to higher rates of crime. What about like housing, jobs? Is there anything else like that has such a direct correlation?
They're all connected, right? Lack of housing, of food insecurity, um, employment. If you're getting paid less than what you need to earn to be able to survive, and all those things are going to correlate to and have a direct line to crime. Um, but again, I think in some ways they're all connected and they all work hand in hand. And education is one that is just so powerful. It truly it is so powerful. I would wanna. I think you mentioned the possible statistic, the overwhelming statistic of people that are in prison that experience trauma. I would be interested in people that are in prison and their level of education, their reading level, right?
Mm,
Uh, Again, you look at our current status, our current way of how we're dealing with education. I mean, we're missing the mark even on reading comprehension. That's concerning. because then what that has the possibility to lead that child to commit a crime out of necessity rather than out of just pure choice. So yeah, I think that there's a lot. All those things that you brought up have a correlation to that behavior coming up for those people.
So the irony in all of this to me is some of the things that you just mentioned that have a negative correlation on increased crime, poor education, food insecurity, lack of housing. Right at this current time, as we sit here in Indiana, because of the Indiana property tax bill, there's going to be a lot of money cut from schools. The Republicans in Congress are going to cut food benefits from a lot of people. There's going to be less affordable housing. There's going to be cuts to Medicaid. All these kinds of things that are going to directly lead to increased crime, that then they're going to turn around and say, well, look at the crime, we need to whatever. And you know it's going to be the wrong response. Deploy the National Guard, have stronger jail sentences, blame city mayors, when it's these structural issues that we're just turning a blind eye to, and then just saying we just need to lock more people up and throw away the key. And it's like we're just chasing our tail.
Yeah. I mean, it is a story as old as time, right? Like it is, and the piece that we're missing about this, and this is where again, the people that are there to provide those services are going to be the ones impacted in so many ways. I mean, teachers themselves are going to be impacted by this. Their workload may increase by these decisions. Police officers are going to have to deal with more people based on, again, the decisions that are made to really dehumanize what is currently going on here in our nation. It's so unfortunate, and that's where I wish more people were concerned about these decisions that are being made, to be honest with you, because it will have a ripple effect in ways that we're not even considering at the moment. We won't see it until about a year or two from now. I can't remember his name right off the bat, but it's a phenomenal TED Talk. And this person had gone to prison, educated himself in prison, and he talks about how essentially, like, even when they were trying to get rid of the Head Start program, right? The Head Start program showed tremendous return on the investment for the community and for the nation. A lot of people were against it because it was like, well, why are we putting money here? These people don't deserve it. Well, actually, in the long term, the Head Start program created amazing opportunities for those children that got that benefit. But you remove that program, which then in return creates the possibility for a crime. So this person essentially said, and it's always stuck with me, that in some ways, when we make decisions like that, you rather put a sentence in front of a person rather than the person being able to put a sentence together. Right? So I just put a life sentence in front of you by the political decision that I just made, rather than empowering you so you can learn how to express yourself, so you can learn how to be and function as a person that is literate and that is educated. And from then on, I was like, holy smokes, that's what we're doing.
Yeah.
In many ways, that is what's happening, and it's sad. Like it truly, it brings up emotions for me because I'm like, yeah, it's just so dehumanizing and just, yeah, it eats at the foundation of what humanity can look like. So we destroy it.
Yeah. And that's something that it keeps going back. I keep running back into this point as we're dealing with different issues in society. It's just a lack of empathy in our society, a lack of caring what happens to other people, and this desire to see, well, I suffered this, so you should have to suffer also. Government didn't pay for my Head Start, so why should you get yours paid for? And I don't. I've just never felt that way. So, I hope one day to figure. You know what? Maybe I'll understand how they feel, but I don't want to ever feel the way they feel. I'm very glad of the fact that I want someone else to not suffer things that I've had to suffer, because that's just fucked up, honestly. But look, I could talk to you about this stuff all day because I'm very just the way you approach everything. It's very impressive to me. I feel like you're bringing in like 1,000 different sociology and psychology and social sciences, and all these things meld together into these topics that we've really reduced down to one single good or bad. And that's one of the reasons that I wanted to have you on, was to talk about the way that this, I guess we'll call it a pellet gun shooting in Indianapolis with an IMPD officer. And I think a lot of it, from my standpoint, or from a lot of people online, is it's a quick thing to look at it and say, like, why did he do that, right? Mm-hmm. But I think it's a harder thing to actually care to know why that happened. So I know that, you're not speaking for that officer, or you haven't been through his exact perspective, but you've seen the video, right? And you've read the statement.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And with the backdrop of everything we've talked about so far, I guess, like, what do you think that the officer was reacting to?
In some ways, by reading the body, by reading because even though you're not there, you can still read the scene, right? You can still visualize it. You can still kind of, especially as a police officer being put in that, as a prior police officer being put in positions like that. I believe there's a little bit of both in that. There's a little bit of fear, right? There's a little bit of response from like that subconscious programming. And there's also a little bit of authority that, you know what? Because here's the thing, again, I can create space from a person by simply backing up. But the minute that I touched you, what makes you think, what do you think it's going to be their response from that other person? They're going to respond by swatting my hand, by pushing me too. So in my opinion, from what I saw, it was unfortunate to see that the first person that created that contact, even though it may be, we may not have all the context, right? But from what I can see in that moment, I'm like, in my mind, I'm like, why didn't that officer just back up? If that juvenile or that young person was too close to you, why didn't you just back up without you feeling that you had to push them off of you? They were not even, again, I think both of his hands, or one of his hands was in his pocket. You have a lot of other officers that have backup. If you were fearful that his hand was in his pocket, and if it was something threatening to you, the pellet gun was not going to be the answer. It would have been your handgun. So there was a lot in that interaction. But I agree with what you said. Is I think people go to the why rather than asking the what happened, what is happening in that officer's mind. And I think the more that we change that mindset, the more that we actually can start to create an understanding of why, or not why, but where these decisions come from. Right. I was disappointed by the statement, or the press release, or like the statement from the police department. It felt to me like you're just trying to cover it up. You're trying to just like justify what happened. But yeah, in some ways that officer could have chosen other decisions or other choices that did not have to lead to that level of interaction, of violent interaction. I applaud, honestly, and I hate that I have to applaud that type of response from the person receiving the treatment, but it was just, again, I think that is one of those scenarios where you do have a level of authority and power over people that showed up, rather than again responding in a way that was still connecting in that whole situation.
And through a lot of what we've talked about today, you've really brought two different point of views to this situation that I didn't have before, right? And one of them is just the idea that the police officer approached with the pellet gun, right? And I believe the guy even says to him, like, what are you coming here with that for? And that takes me back to when you talked earlier about how the police officers are holding the vests in a kind of ready to go situation. And if he is approaching this guy with a weapon out like that, that changes the dynamic than if there's not a weapon. But on the flip side of that, I also think now, well, I'm just looking at the video and thinking, well, what happened immediately before that video? But it's about impossible to judge that officer and how he acted in that situation without considering all of the training, any of the mental health, any of the other things that he's responded to, trauma, things that he's seen. We don't know what he has been through before. And that's not to make excuses for anyone. But it is to say, if we want to treat people as more than just there's black and white, good and bad, then we have to consider the possibility that someone is not just good or bad.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But also, so just from your perspective, how do you think that officer should have acted as he came up to that situation? Now, obviously, hindsight's 20/20, and we don't know everything before that. But I mean, we have that scene on video. You know, if you're advising that officer, what are you telling him?
You know, I think when looking at that and not having every piece of information in front of us, I would say that the response would have to be more one that is not, I mean, just having the gun, the pellet gun right slung, like when you have the sling right on your shoulder, that tells you already what type of action you're gonna take, essentially. That you're getting ready to respond in that manner. So maybe not having that in front of you or holding on to it almost the whole time as you're having this interaction would tell the other person that, hey, I'm willing to de-escalate this situation in a way. Utilize verbal communication too, right? There's something called verbal judo. And I think that's what officers tend to miss, is that we can de-escalate a situation just by verbally just communicating with you and reassuring that you're safe in this moment, there's a way to work with one another so that even though you may be escalated, I don't have to match that to be able to bring you down. I can still remain in a very neutral or a very guarded position that can still keep me safe. But if I escalate it, what you're going to do naturally is you're going to want to go up. And at that point, it just becomes a match of power. So how do you show up within your own power, not to control somebody else, but to be able to just to control the scene in a safe way that doesn't have to lead to that. And again, when we go back to training, I did not receive most of my de-escalation practices up until I became a hostage negotiator. That's when, for me, I started to become more of a connecting police officer, right? Because I was actually able to see the humanity of the person, even though I never saw them. I would talk to them on the phone, right? So there was already a layer of disconnect, a personal disconnection. But I was still able to create something through the verbal connection with that person to be able to de-escalate. But yeah, most of my training that I obtained was from being a hostage negotiator, whether it was the FBI school or just the national school that is offered. And I wish those practices were given to all officers from the beginning. But again, we are trained more of our hours go to defense tactics, vehicle maneuvers, police are shooting your gun, and really that's about it. So
it's not that the training doesn't exist. It's just that it's not the focus.
It's not the focus, for sure. For sure. It's not, again, culturally, it is not the foundation. De-escalation is not something that is emphasized as much as it really should be. Again, there were many officers in that scene that we saw in that video. Can another officer step in, right? Can another officer try to connect with that person rather than you be? If you already know someone is highly escalated with you, why can I just step away and have someone else come in? It's the same thing with parenting, right? At times, my daughter may be extremely upset with me. So you know what? Let me step off. Let me step away and let another adult step in for me. So that's when we also got to think about ourselves as egotistical human beings and being able to recognize and have enough self-awareness to say, you know what? My presence alone is what's causing this. So what if someone else came in with a whole different energy, with a whole different vibe? What could that do? So it's recognizing that. It's recognizing that within the team as well. That, hey man, just step away, I got it. I remember going on a call like similar to that. This person was extremely escalated. They were yelling, they were cursing, they were even threatening the other officer that I was with, younger officer. And I was like, hey man, just step off. I started talking with the person, and at the end, this guy told us, I'm from Chicago. I was in prison. I was in the penitentiary. You don't scare me. So what makes you think you being escalated is going to change anything? He's already telling you he's been with some extremely violent people, and you think yelling, raising your voice is going to do anything. So then I step in, and at the end of the call, the guy ended up leaving the house that we were asking him to leave, and he looks at me, he said, man, you know what? I'm leaving because of you. Otherwise, I would have beat his ass. But then it's also recognizing the humanity of the person. It's recognizing that, hey, you're a human being. Let's reset here. How can we reset this whole situation? And it's okay to press reset. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It's okay to pause and restart. If we do it with our own videos and our own Netflix shows, why can't we do it in life in that moment, in an interaction with somebody else, so we can create a new experience, so we can create something different, right? Yeah. So yeah.
Well, I have to tell you, hearing about what you've learned as a hostage negotiator, I have 4 teenagers at home, and I'm starting to think that I need some hostage negotiation trainings to get them to do the shit they're supposed to. Anwar, I want to say thank you. This was amazing. I learned a lot, and I hope that the listeners did too. But before we go, I have to ask one question. Is there a backstory behind the Tractor Supply hat?
No, there's not. I just wear a lot of Tractor Supply hats. I don't work for Tractor Supply. I'm not sponsored by Tractor Supply. I just, they have cheap hats, and in the summer, I don't like to put product on my hair, so I just. It's a good question, though. Phenomenal question.
So, growing up in rural Indiana, Tractor Supply is a way of life, but now I can't really think about it as anything else other than that's during COVID, where people were trying to go buy horse pills to get rid of COVID. And I think they just took horse pills. Yeah. I don't think it did anything. So
yeah, I don't know that it worked either.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this time. It's been great to have you, and I look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. Welcome back to the On Trial with Josh Lowry podcast here on Landis Media. Now time for my closing argument. So you just heard my interview with Anuar Velazquez, and I apologize for a part of it. I think you saw a lot of me literally working through things in my head. I think I went into that interview with some preconceived notions of police officers, what they're trained to do, how they're taught to respond, so on and so forth. Anwar shook a lot of stuff, right? I mentioned at one point how he brought so many different fields into this. I felt like there's psychology, sociology, social sciences, all kinds of stuff. And there were a few parts where I literally felt kind of just like jaw hitting the floor. I just happened to be, recording a podcast as it happened. But I think that goes to the quality of what Anwar was saying, because there were a lot of things I just hadn't thought about. And so now I want to kind of sum up kind of my takeaways. And if we're putting this issue on trial, this issue of excessive force being used by police, I think here's my closing argument. We see these individual instances of excessive force used, and I actually think it's the easy response to just go, that's a bad person. The police officer is a bad person. Get rid of the bad ones. But that's not solving the problem, because these instances keep happening. We have to think about the fact that there's hundreds of thousands of police officers across the country. There's thousands of cities. There's 350 million people that these police officers might have to deal with. The idea that we're just going to get rid of someone when they screw up isn't causing the underlying problem of what's leading to that. Not to mention, look, if someone is the victim of excessive force that costs them their life, firing a police officer at that point doesn't help get that person back. And one of the things that I refuse to do as I've gotten involved in politics, entered public life, I want to solve problems. We spend so much time in our society just talking past each other because that's what works on snippets, that's what works on TV, that works in little clips that I can put on my bumper sticker, right? But if we're going to actually try to work on this underlying issue, what Anwar explained is it's more of a culture that is leading to police officers using this excessive force. And to be clear, what I'm about to say, I would ask any police officer to let me know what they think, right? Because I think we took a nuanced approach to this. Like, look, of course there are a ton of police officers doing good things all the time, right? And so this isn't like just coming down, but that's not the problem, right? We don't really just talk about the good things. Here in Indiana, we saw a man get confronted. A pellet gun was used on him. He's thrown to the ground. He was punched when it really appeared like he wasn't doing anything. That's a problem, and we need to talk about how to prevent that going forward. And my takeaways from this conversation with Anwar were a couple of things. One, it was very interesting to me that he pointed out that he actually thought most people, most police officers go into law enforcement like, I want to help people. I want to make the world a better place. And it is the job and the culture around the job that changes their approach. A lot of it, he talked about, there's not a lot of trauma training, or pretty much none. Not a lot of mental health training. And basically the idea is like, look, if you become a police officer and early on as a police officer, you have a violent interaction where you're attacked by someone. You're involved in a violent situation. That's now a part of you, right? That's in your brain as you're going to each of these situations. So when we were talking about the police officer, as he approached this, young man in Indianapolis, that police officer is not just approaching that man with what he's seeing right then. There's everything that's in his head. There's everything that he's been through. There's all of his training. He's the sum of his experiences. And if you've had a situation that is traumatic early on as a police officer, what Anwar explains, there's not really training for it. And even if there is therapy available, that's not the culture that's created. That doesn't make people feel like they're able to get help. I think this one hit home for me a lot because of my wife and I being foster parents. So much of our training and our ongoing training, and we've taken upon ourselves to do extra reading and learn, is about dealing with childhood trauma. Something that happens to you early on in your life can absolutely derail the rest of your life. That's why it's unfortunately so common. I believe the number is more than 50% of people that are in the foster system that end up in jail. Because here's what happens. They go in the foster system there's a traumatic event that put them in the system, even if they had a perfect situation where they go straight to a good home and they get a doctor right away and nothing ever happens, or maybe they go back to their parents, who knows? A lot of kids are just going to deal with it. They're never going to work through that trauma, that abuse, that trust issue, that inability to depend on people. And it does affect the way they act when they grow up. It does affect their relationships. It does affect their ability to function. That's why it's been so important for my wife and I to make sure that we are open and aware of working through the kid's trauma. Now, that is with a kid that may have been abused, right? May have been neglected. With police officers, we're talking about who knows what they've even seen. And if there's no, therapy, if there's no training, if there's no, whatever it is, whatever the professional, correct response is to get the person the help they need, then every time that they respond to a situation in the future, they're responding with that trauma. That's now part of you, right? It doesn't go away. And therapy and mental health training and all this stuff, right? Like, you don't make the trauma go away. You learn to deal with it. And we have to remember, and this of course is not to make excuses for the way anyone that behaves, but if we're going to talk about how do we make situations better, we have to remember that if every police officer is responding to a situation and in their head is all of the situations they've responded to, that we are then working through those previous situations, especially if they've been through trauma. I mean, PTSD is the thing, right? That I would imagine most of us know somebody that has it, or we know somebody that was, in Iraq or Afghanistan and has it. Some instance or some event or something that has literally caused a traumatic response in their brain. Post-traumatic stress disorder. I mean, that's why it's called that, right? With a lot of our police officers, they're going out and seeing things that would mess up any of us, but they're not always dealing with that. And that's a failure on the culture, but it's not just the police themselves. I mentioned this during the interview with Anuar, but I put a lot of blame on the politicians for this, because they have done so much, and I'm looking specifically you Republicans, but we've heard some Democrats do this too. They've thrown so much red meat out there, this idea that they're pro-law enforcement and that Democrats are for crime, that they've created such a situation where they can't even possibly suggest that a police officer ever did something wrong. I'm not saying even criticize, but if you offer help to someone, you're saying they need help. These politicians have created such a black and white, I'm pro-police or I'm anti-crime. There's no in between. They feel like they can't even suggest that someone might need help. I'm going to say this a lot on this podcast. It's probably going to be part of almost every closing argument, but it's the truth. The fact that there have become these cable news channels or radio shows, Fox News, all these things, that have made the only goal to say Republicans good, Democrats bad, has taken away the ability to talk about anything in a nuanced way. Because now a politician either has to say they're pro-police or nothing. There's no other way, right? Was it 2020? Like they created this whole, you're either pro-police or you're defund the police. But you could be pro-police and want the police to have better resources, better training. You could not want to defund the police, but still think that there should be greater tools and assistance given. But whenever someone has to win an electoral race, their goal is to dumb things down as much as possible. Make it a choice between this issue or that issue. And we've all seen it in the mail, in the ads, everything. It's either crime or cops. They make it like it's a distinct decision. And so now they're creating a culture for the police where either, I want to make sure I say this right, where the police either feel like they have absolute impunity from anything they do, whether right or wrong, or they're creating a situation where even if the police officer wants to get help, the resources and the help are not provided because to offer help would somehow be anti-police. You guys see what I'm saying? Like it's become this so one-sided, I'm pro law enforcement, can't say a bad word about them. Like, that doesn't help anyone, right? Like, 99% of what someone does can be good, but if they still have a problem of 1% of an area, we still want to address that issue. So, look, the dumbing down of politics has screwed over a lot of America, and I think that's happened here. Another issue that Anuar pointed out that really struck me was that, like, the first time that he had de-escalation training, I guess there's very moderate, but like the first time he was really taught how to de-escalate, how to talk someone down, was when he went to training to deal with hostages. I'll be honest, I was surprised by that. I didn't know. I know there's been a lot of movement across America to try to not use police officers as social workers, right? Not having them respond to certain behavioral health situations. But like, just by the given nature of what they're doing, there's going to be times where there's a situation that's up here and really needs to be taken down. And again, that's not coming from me, right? You heard an actual former police officer say, we need more de-escalation training. I think if you take that right back to that video, that Indianapolis officer walking up to the guy, there certainly could have been some de-escalation there. But again, has that officer ever even been trained on that? Has that been offered to him? And maybe the last time that officer went up to someone like that, something did happen. Look, you're trained to respond to things, just like a sport, right? Like, they move this way, you move that way. That's what Anuar was saying. It's basically the same thing. So the takeaway, and I think the thing that we really need to see from this, from a whole conversation with Anuar, is what happened in downtown Indy when that officer fired that pellet gun for what appeared to be no reason. That's not just some one random problem. That's a symptom of a culture that has been created, has been insulated, and is not, I don't think it's achieving what it was intended to achieve. I could tell you when I worked with the state police, I heard officers talk about this exact thing. I heard officers that were involved in use of force that said they wished it never happened. Right? If, as a society, we want to actually start making improvements, we can't deal with every issue as an independent, random issue. Right? I mean, that's what these, like, I know these are not the same, but you know what I mean here. Like, we clearly have an issue in this country of gun violence. It's too easy to get these weapons of war. We have mass shootings at a rate that happens in no other civilized country. And every time these Republican senators and congressmen are, oh, this is terrible. How did anybody know this was going to happen? This is just a bad person. Oh, this is just a bad person. This is just a bad person. Doesn't happen in any other fucking country. Maybe it's not just a bunch of random bad people that only exist in America. Maybe there's a bunch of random bad people exist all over the world. They don't have access to weapons of war so easily. But when we deal with it like it's a bunch of random individual issues with no underlying cause, then what are you going to do about it? How do you prevent a one-off? And I think that's what's happening with these uses of excessive force that we keep seeing. There is an underlying issue. And from my conversation with Anuar, it sounds to me like most police want to do better, want to serve and protect. And they know that these situations are not good. But if they're going to find a way to treat this kind of underlying symptom, this underlying condition, it's going to take all of us. Because it's easy to just say, hey, please fix yourself. I think a lot of the people that listen to this podcast, obviously myself included, are involved in politics, want to be involved in politics, want to have a say in the decisions that are made in their local government, their state, the country. We need to make sure that we make it okay for anyone to talk about trauma, mental health, and to try to deal with these issues. Because I think what happened on that video in Indy was completely avoidable. And I think that there are a lot of these uses of force that were avoidable. And I know that there are a lot of police officers that want those situations to be avoided. So, what's the takeaway? Two big ones. One, it doesn't matter what you're in. If it's a professional, a personal, a family, anything, don't ever be worried. Not worried. Don't ever be scared to seek help. And also, it's so important to create a culture where other people feel like they can get help. And two, if you want to change the culture, you have to change the culture. I think we're going to run into that a lot on this podcast. That was a heavy issue, guys. I'm not going to lie. But I want to thank Anuar Velazquez again for joining me. A great conversation. I had a great time. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Join us next time on Trial with Josh Lowry. Thank you to Landis Media and everyone involved. And I will catch you guys on the next episode.
On Trial with Josh Lowry.